Hey everyone, and welcome to the Esports and Beyond podcast. Our guest today is Remer Rietkerk, Head of Esports at Newzoo, a leader in esports and gaming analytics and market research. Prior to joining Newzoo in September 2019, Remer spent about 4 years working at Riot Games, where he was in charge of league management operations. Newzoo just published their annual Global Esports Market report, and we would love to hear more about the upcoming industry trends. Welcome, Remer, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Thank you. To start off with, tell us your personal story. How did you end up covering the sports and gaming sector?
Sure. Yeah, that was sort of an accident, if I'm honest. So I had originally gone to school, did my bachelor's and master's kind of with an eye on going into investment banking, finance, so master's in business economics and finance. My first job out of school, I was working at a large, believe it or not, it is a large Dutch bank, but a few of those do exist. And I was working in a division that worked on commodity financing, and I was supporting the front office team. I have been a lifelong gamer, but in terms of career, I'd always thought I'd go into investment, finance, that kind of thing. So in my job there, it was a very, very dry form of investment banking, very low risk, very everything is very secure, very simple transactions, low interest rates. So very smart, safe banking, but not necessarily as exciting for a young guy coming out of school. And all the deals would happen kind of Monday through Wednesday, and then they get sent over to the mid-office team and the mid-office team who would process the deals. So Thursdays and Fridays, I had nothing to do at work, but I was a young graduate. I wanted to, see them all put together. I was going in the bank in my suit every day. So I wasn't going to go sit at the computer and just like browse Reddit and YouTube, but I wanted to do something so I didn't just stare at a screen all day and do nothing. So I started writing ideas. So I started with kind of book ideas or whatever. And every day on my way home, I'd start on Thursdays and Fridays, I'd start watching the EULCS at the time. And I hadn't been a huge esports guy, more of a lifelong gamer, but I had gotten into the EULCS, and it was this great summer where Fnatic was undefeated, and it was very exciting to see, can anyone beat them? And so the next idea I'd had was sort of just an idea for an esports tournament. So it was a thought exercise to stay sane. I wrote up a business plan for an esports tournament idea I had. I really went everything, kind of capital requirements, fundraising, format, schedule, personnel needs, the whole thing, just as a thought exercise. And I thought, well, I don't know if I really want to go out and do this independently, but this could be a cool job. And I saw a position at Riot for a league operations position there. So I applied, I attached my business plan, thought, why not? And one thing led to another. I ended up getting hired, and that sort of was the start of my esports career. And yeah, it was not really the direction I thought I'd go. I originally told myself, we'll give it 3 years. And if you're still here in 3 years, this is it. And well, we're now 6 years in. So I'm an esports guy now.
I guess you had enjoyed your experience so far.
It's been a fun journey.
Sounds very interesting. I also personally started my career in investment banking, and I'm still on the investment side. But never could have forecasted, investing in sports and gaming. But I think it's one of the most interesting places to be at the moment.
That's fun.
You just published a report as part of your position with Newzoo, which is, I guess, an annual report, Global Esports for 2021. Maybe for the audience and the readers that haven't yet gone through the report, what are some of the trends that you're forecasting for this year?
Sure. Yeah. And to add a little more color for those who are unfamiliar, the esports, it's now the Global Esports and Live Streaming Market Report, because we expanded the scope for 2021. So we also capture live streaming, is sort of, without sounding too braggadocious, I would argue is probably the industry standard when it comes to benchmarking kind of revenue and audience sizes in the global esports market. So we've been doing these forecasts, I think, since 2014. And every year we publish a new report where we try and keep everyone up to date on the latest things in the industry, and we forecast out in the coming years. In terms of the specific trends for esports that we've called out, I'd say let's begin with the perennial trend, or I call it perennial. It's been 2 years, but mobile has continued to have just a phenomenal rise. it is remarkable, really, when you look at 2018 numbers to 2020, 2021 numbers, just the growth that mobile has seen. In 2020, when it comes to the most watched esports titles by esports hours watched, the top three are still the top three: League of Legends, Counter-Strike, Dota, and that's to be expected. But 4 through 7 are all mobile titles, and that is brand new. I mean, that is really brand new. Mobile was not relevant 2 years ago. You had a little bit of Clash Royale, and none of these titles were, even making charts 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and now they are sitting on top of them. So mobile is definitely an exciting one. Another thing we talked about was kind of brandification of esports teams and the diversification in their revenue stream. So most esports teams sort of started in the traditional sports team model, right? So you try and look for league distributions around media rights. You try and do match day, but they don't have arenas, so there's no match day revenue. And you try and get sponsorship revenue, which is sort of the only thing that they were chasing. And we've seen it's kind of worked. The match day is still missing, obviously, because esports teams don't have their own arenas and they aren't doing their matches home and away. The media rights remains a challenge because you don't have TV channels aggressively bidding for esports teams, like for esports events, right? Instead, it's kind of a codependent relationship with Twitch and YouTube. Exclusivity doesn't really work because these platforms are a lot stickier than a TV channel, right? It's very easy to watch one year on Fox and the next year on NBC. It's much harder to convince someone to go off Twitch to YouTube or Mixer, rest in peace, or Facebook Gaming, if they have sort of all of their things on this platform, right? Because they've got Prime, they've got their notifications set up, they've got their communities they're involved in. It's a much stickier environment than a TV channel. So instead, you've got this sort of armed truce between the organizers and the platforms, because the organizers need the platforms to get their product out there and to get their sponsorship returns, and the platforms want to sell the events, but not as a product, rather as a loss leader. Anyway, this is a long tangent on revenues, but point being, for esports teams specifically, they are trying to find new ways to make revenue, and you're seeing kind of two really big trends happen. So one is the lifestyle brandification, if you will, right? So really moving hard into the apparel space, into this identity outside of just being an esports team. So I think the best examples of that are 100 Thieves and FaZe Clan. G2 to a lesser degree as well in Europe, who really do a good job of producing a lot of merch that's not just jerseys, but is whatever, it's like limited lines and collections, and they try and really stick with kind of modern fashion or urban fashion. And it creates a whole kind of new business for them. And in some ways, it's a very old business, right? It's selling clothes, but it allows them to kind of leverage some of their brand identity in the competitive space to help build out new revenue lines. The other one we're seeing is basically streamers. So a lot of esports organizations are kind of doing almost streamer collective work, right? And there's a few advantages there, and there's some positive synergies between both sides. For the streamers themselves, obviously, if you're a mid-tier streamer, having the kind of sales support and having the promotion and the back office help from a esports team is great, right? Because they can take care of editors and they can help you produce content. There's a lot of work that goes around being a full-time streamer beyond just putting on a camera and playing games. So that helps a lot. And then for the esports organization, they now have more views that they can sell against, right? They have more fans that they can sell against, and more content they can sell against. So there's a symbiotic relationship there that we've seen quite a few esports organizations either toy with or go very hard into. I think, for example, TSM is an example of an organization that has been an early mover in this and continues to do a lot of work in that space. Another trend we've seen is the continued, let's say, convergence between sports and esports, which is more to say the traditional sports organizations getting involved in esports in different ways. This obviously got a very big bump when the lockdowns happened, because suddenly, I saw a meme, I remember back in like April, May 2020, And it was like 2019, esports isn't sports. 2020, esports is the only sport, which is in a sense true. And for traditional sports, a lot of these organizations have had, let's say vague and ambiguous plans or small things they're doing in esports, but they couldn't quite figure it out. Suddenly, they didn't have any traditional sports content to run, right? Only reruns and classics and whatever. And so almost all of them just suddenly went super hard on esports while they tried to figure out like what to do. And this is everything from the F1 virtual Grand Prix, the NBA 2K Players Tournament, for example. You had the La Liga Santander Challenge, which was very cool. And these are all have had success to varying degrees, right? So some of the things, I think the virtual Grand Prix, for example, put up incredible viewership. They really ran it. They had some real racers in there, and they ran it like kind of as if it was a real Grand Prix, replacing it didn't count for the circuit points, but replacing the circuit in terms of scheduling. The other things that weren't as successful. Now, what's important here is that a lot of lessons were learned, right? I think that it's often tricky for sports organizations to get into esports because they don't fully understand it, and they think a lot of the rules that apply in sports apply in esports. They don't always. But getting their feet wet has been really good, right? And I expect that you're going to see these efforts continue to refine. And we're already seeing some change, right? Like we're seeing that a lot of the traditional sports organizations are realizing that one of the great things esports can be used for is brand building for their star players. So esports and streaming and all of that is very connected, right? There's a great quote, I forget who said it, but that esports is a conversation, right? If traditional sports is more of a show, esports is a conversation. And getting your traditional sports stars involved in that conversation is a great way to bring in young fans, is a great way to bring in interest and value. I remember back in like 2019, SBJ did they asked kind of industry experts, I think they did a panel where they said, who are the most valuable stars in the NFL? And I think number 7 on their panel was Juju Smith-Schuster. He's a good player. He's not the 7th best player in the NFL by any means, right? Like, so he's good, but he's not incredible. But what he's done very well is he's active on Twitch, he streams, he's active on social media. He has a profile that far exceeds, let's say, his competitive profile because of how he's a younger guy who's part of that generation, and he's interacted with those fans. And I think traditional sports organizations are seeing that, and that's a direction we're seeing the industry move as traditional sports get involved with esports. The other thing that we sort of noticed, I don't know if it's as much of a trend as a big impact we noticed, is the resilience of regional league play versus international tournaments. So there's kind of been 2 schools of thought when it comes to approaching esports ecosystems. You have the international tournament circuit and you have the regional league circuit. When it comes to regional league play, typically, it's a league. It happens over an extended period of time. You're only competing with local teams, and that feeds into more international competitions. That's like a League of Legends is the best example of that. When it comes to the international circuit, it's a little more freeform, degrees of freeform, but typically you have big important tournaments happening throughout the year where all the best teams are coming over and over to different locations in the world and competing. That's Counter-Strike, that's Dota 2. So when travel restrictions came into effect, you couldn't do the international circuits anymore, right? And that was kind of a big problem. So at the same time that you saw League of Legends, because they just continued as ever, but now everyone had to stay inside and watch stuff, so why not watch the League of Legends tournaments? League of Legends was hitting new viewership heights, I think, in every region globally. But at the same time, Counter-Strike was sort of struggling a bit in the beginning, right? They all their fans were accustomed to the certain style and ecosystem and format, and suddenly they're trying to do these regional tournaments, and a lot of the big like events are having to delay and then cancel and pivot, and the whole like ecosystem narrative kind of came apart. I think they've recovered and they've sort of figured it out now, but it highlighted how fragile that kind of ecosystem can be. I think the even bigger example is Dota 2, where they literally just canceled the rest of their season. All right, we're just not going to do anything for the rest of the year. It's like, okay. So like that, it's going to be interesting to see as new games enter the space, as new ecosystems pop up, to see if people look to the resilience that we actually saw in that league and regional play, and there's also business benefits to the league and style of format, whereas of course there's viewership benefits to the tournament style. It'll be interesting to see if that changes the calculation and how people spin up new ecosystems, and if they look to trying to create more of this regional approach. Yeah. So yeah, those are the trends. Sorry, a little long-winded.
No, perfect. Thanks a lot. That's a lot of content to process. A few times you mentioned actually, the lockdowns and the pandemic and, going traditional sports being impacted, and that put kind of esports on the map of being a, big sport at the moment. So I think there's no question out there that the pandemic has really affected the industry, and in most ways in a positive way, and audience has increased, reach has increased, and now esports is, a trend and something that's here to stay. I think there's no question about that. Maybe if you can go a little bit more into details on how the trends that the pandemic has pretty much caused, which ones are here to stay and which ones are pretty much just short term, and how do you see the long-term impact of the current situation on esports?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the first thing actually, Viktoria, is I might have to challenge is the idea that the pandemic has been mostly positive. If I was to classify it, I would call it a mixed bag, and I'll elaborate on why. So, I think, as I mentioned, obviously the major disruption to Counter-Strike and Dota is a significant thing, right? These are two of the biggest value drivers in the esports industry. I mean, if, League of Legends is European football, then Counter-Strike is basketball, and Dota is American football or cricket or something, right? You know what I mean? Like, these are some of the biggest sports and highest interest sports globally. So having that kind of disruption to two big ecosystems where you're losing the international, which is one of the largest tournaments of the year and most important tournaments of the year, is a pretty big problem for the industry, right? And so actually there's a funny stat. I was looking because I was curious. I was reviewing the total esports hours watched from 2018, 2019, 2020, the growth, right? So 2018 to 2019 was about 12%. 13% in terms of total esports hours watched over the year. 2019 to 2020 was about 12%. So in a way, it's almost like nothing happened, but the reality is a lot happened and sort of warped the market, right? So on the negative side, as I mentioned, you're losing major ecosystems, and you may, as you probably know, esports fans actually often don't watch more than one esport. They tend to be a fan of their esport. So for Dota fans, this is a big problem. You're losing all of the esports content that you love. For Counter-Strike fans, it's also a challenge because you're losing some of it. It's changing. It might not be as interesting to you as it used to be. So these are major disruptions. At the same time, what you are seeing is you're seeing a massive growth in viewership coming out of basically Southeast Asia, South Asia, through the mobile games, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, PUBG Mobile, Arena Valor, Mobile Legends Bang Bang, and Garena Free Fire are not in that order, but are the 4th through 7th most watched esports titles. And these guys came, as I mentioned earlier, out of nowhere. So they're actually offsetting some of the losses that you got from the disruption, right? And when it comes to executing tournaments, I mean, losing real big international competition is a problem as well. Like the travel restrictions are actually in some ways the bigger problem than the lockdown, because you cannot in most esports have a fair tournament that happens from globally. Because to kind of elaborate on this for your listeners and viewers, when you are competing in Counter-Strike, every millisecond counts, right? And so if you have players in Europe and players in Asia and players in America, whoever is close to the server is going to have a much lower latency to that server, a lower ping, right? So that means that people in Asia and America might be playing on 100, 120, 150 ping, so basically milliseconds of travel and server time, whereas people in Europe are going to be playing on 10, 20, 30. When these moments come down to such narrow margins, that means that the European players are going to have a very significant competitive advantage in that context. So travel restrictions and risk around travel has actually made, not to mention the fact that you can no longer fill stadiums, so there's also a downside in terms of organizing from a revenue perspective, has made international competition, which is usually the most exciting part of any esport, incredibly challenging. And that has had a detrimental effect to this space. The other thing as well to look out for is the kind of market instability and uncertainty, right? A lot of companies are looking nervously at just the market in general, not the esports market, but they have a lot of people who are unemployed. Equity markets are up, but is that sustainable? Are they inflated? What is happening? It's completely unhinged from reality. We don't. It's a different topic for a different podcast. So when you view market instability or volatility as a company, especially a consumer brands company who's dependent on consumer spend, one of the easiest things to cut is marketing, because you say, all right, well, right now we want to make sure that we have a war chest if things go really bad. We want to make sure that the company can survive a downturn. Let's save some money. Let's be a little more cautious with our spending. And they're cutting, in part, sports and esports sponsorship spend. And so a lot of esports teams, and I've been hearing this from some of the owners I know as well, is that, well, with their current partners, everything is fine. They can get renewals. The sales pipeline, so bringing on new partners and expanding their portfolio, has pretty much dried up because everyone's a little nervous about the market and isn't really sure what to do. So these are some downsides. On the upside, of course, the ecosystems that have been able to weather this relatively unchanged, like League of Legends and the mobile, who just keep growing, and they're thriving, right? They're doing better than ever. It's huge value that they're delivering, lots of high profile. And obviously for the industry as a whole, it's gained visibility, gained credibility.
Yeah, so it's fair to conclude that the effect has been mixed, and there are definitely winners and kind of losers in the whole ecosystem. Just to make sure I understand the international tournament, so there's no way to bring those pretty much online instead of having them at like an international kind of big arena and people traveling for the tournament. There's no way, because we work with one of the sports league organizers in Southeast Asia, and what they have done very well during the pandemic is they shifted part of their business model from offline to online, and that has pretty much sustained some of the revenues.
No, so it works completely fine for regional-oriented competition, right? So if they're in Southeast Asia, I'm guessing they might be doing mobile stuff. Those games are very concentrated, typically in Southeast Asia, India, China. That's all relatively close together. You can play online at those distances. It's literally an issue of the speed of light. So you start to run into problems when one team is in Singapore and one team is in Europe, or one team is in Europe and one team is in LA, right? That's when the ping becomes so extreme that you cannot, it becomes unfair, right? It gets a little sketchy even at shorter distances. I remember a test was done once where pros were kind of blind tested on ping. So they would, the organizers who were doing the tests would not show them their ping, and they would manually adjust the ping that the player was experiencing in a controlled environment on the computer as they played. They could only really start to notice ping differences by 25, 30, 35 ping. It in fact affected competitive performance really more as you get to 45, 50, 55, 60. It's okay at 60, but that's really like the limit, right? And when you're talking about Amsterdam, even to New York, you're talking 120. Right? If you're going to LA, you're talking 180. If you're going to Singapore, you're talking 200, right? And just because literally the data has to bounce to the server and back. And so the speed of light is unfortunately a limiting factor in global online play. Yeah.
Maybe something for a new kind of venture idea going forward. If someone can solve that problem, that would be amazing.
It would be very cool if somehow it was the esports industry that figured out how to exceed the speed of light. That would be a very surprising twist in world history.
We're definitely going to invest in that idea. So we mentioned a few kind of trends, for this specific year, but maybe if we take a step back and look like at the industry as a whole over the past couple of years, which are some of the kind of main changes that you have noticed when it comes to demographics? So speaking of the audience, when it comes to regional kind of penetration, you mentioned Southeast Asia is very big on mobile, and we've seen like a big increase in audience there. And also, when we think about the technology and the business model that we're seeing, again, one of the trends is obviously changing the revenue models and having new revenue models for some of the players in the ecosystem. So, what are some of those kind of trends that you've observed in the last couple of years?
Sure. I think that the biggest one to sort of call out is probably just mainstream recognition, right? If I look back to even 6 years ago, most esports sponsors were peripheral companies, right? They were companies who were basically in the space already. It was a very intuitive partnership. I make a keyboard, you play competitively on keyboards. I'll give you keyboards, put the name of my keyboard on your jersey, and I'll be your sponsor, right? That was literally the relationship. And then I always look back to, in some ways, I feel like it was a watershed moment, was the Louis Vuitton Riot Games partnership in 2019. Because now you're talking about a high fashion brand partnering with an esports event, and not only are they doing it and we'll make your jersey, but it was a complex integration. You had not only the trophy case, which Louis Vuitton has done for other companies, but you had IP integrations, right? So there was a League of Legends themed Louis Vuitton clothing line that actually sold out pretty quickly. I think sales were probably predominantly driven in East Asia, but nonetheless, you had skins, so like cosmetics in game designed by Louis Vuitton. You had like a music video created by characters wearing Louis Vuitton. It's like a whole thing, right? So the intellectual property of both companies integrated. It was complex, it was sophisticated, it showed a depth of understanding in the space. And this is coming from Louis Vuitton. This is not coming from a tech company or a peripheral company. This is traditional high fashion. So I think that what you've seen in the last this is one of the biggest shifts, is that the mainstream industry no longer needs to be taught what esports is. Like, they understand it now, and they understand the value of it now in a way that the whole industry had been doing education for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that is starting to really change. I mean, we've even kind of changed our esports report to reflect that. We've realized that we don't need to do as much education anymore, and we need to provide more insight into other things, as opposed to just trying to teach people what's happening, who is who. People who are involved are understanding it. I think that's a big shift. I think that affects everything, right? I mean, when I first started working in esports, I tell people I work in esports, and they go, "Oh, EA Sports, like FIFA? Oh yeah." And I'm like, no, different, not FIFA. I don't work in FIFA, although soon I will be working in FIFA. But it's ironic. Yeah. I mean, so I think that is a pretty seismic shift. Regionally, I think, as we sort of talked about, I think the biggest thing to notice is growth in mobile, unlocking of India through mobile. India has been a market that has not really been relevant in the game space for a very long time, largely because, honestly, there weren't PCs and there weren't consoles to play on. But affordable competitive games on mobile phones has created it into a relevant games market, and now it's becoming a relevant esports market. And I think that's incredibly exciting. I mean, you look at China is the largest, most powerful heavyweight esports market globally in terms of fans, in terms of revenue, whatever. India has the potential to become almost like that. And I mean, the banning of PUBG Mobile was a bit unfortunate, because it definitely disrupted that growth. That was kind of the title leading the Indian esports boom. But we are continuing to see interest and investment there. So I think unlocking of India is really exciting to see. I think business models, we sort of touched on the diversification of revenue streams. I think we're going to continue to see innovations in kind of tech, in terms of digital. It'll be interesting to see that. Everyone recognizes that if esports follows a straight traditional sports model, it's never going to reach its potential. It is different enough that it it has different strengths, and it needs to find ways to identify and then monetize those. I mean, I think that in terms of demographics, the change there is essentially also the main driver behind industry growth. And what I mean by that is that essentially every year you have young people aging into the market. Young people more and more prevalently play video games, more and more prevalently grow up watching first they start with like, YouTube videos of kids doing unboxing or playing games or whatever. That eventually feeds into like YouTube Minecraft videos, because I think even today, like something like 60+% of kids under 13 say Minecraft is their favorite game. Minecraft's positioning in the kids market is incredible. So they start watching Minecraft videos because before they even play Minecraft, right? Because it's just, I don't know, it has this appeal to children. I mean, I still think it's pretty cool as an adult, but it has this appeal to children. Maybe that reflects poorly on me. No. But so it's quite.
It's for professional purpose.
But they start watching these kinds of YouTube content. Eventually, as they turn into teenagers, they're switching to more competitive games. They're also discovering live streaming. They're watching Twitch. They're watching YouTube Live. And that feeds in very easy to esports. There's a much lower hurdle to get from point A to point B than in older generations. And so I almost look at it like, if all of society is just a bar, right? Kind of esports as this triangle that's moving and filling up more of the bar, right? Because more and more young people are aging into the market. They watch esports. They grew up with watching gaming content. It's more normalized. There's not that hurdle to overcome. They don't think it's weird to watch people play video games. And so they're stepping in and watching esports. What this means, obviously, is that the market is marginally getting older because just more people are getting older. There's more, people like me are now in the 30s watching esports. That was less common. But it's also getting larger, a lot larger. And I think that this is a demographic trend, which is kind of at a very fundamentals level going to drive the industry forward for the next 20 years, because you're going to continue to have a larger and larger percentage of people watching esports because they grew up with all of this kind of stuff, gaming content, all of that competition, watching it. And you're also going to start to see more and more support in terms of like in the school system, right? You're seeing more and more high school teams and that kind of stuff. This is going to continue to grow as well, which means it's going to be more integrated into their competition, and like a formalized gaming competition is going to be more integrated into their educational path, into their youth. So on it is the fundamentals driver that's pushing the industry forward, and I think will continue to. That's why, you're going to see ups and downs, you're going to see challenges, but I think unless something dramatically changes, just the pure demographic drive means that the industry is positioned to grow from an audience perspective for 20 years.
Yeah. So I think that's super interesting, and I think we totally agree with the growth from an audience perspective. And it's very interesting to think about the monetization and growth from a revenue perspective. So you mentioned briefly that esports will never get monetized the way traditional sports have been. But maybe to go a little bit further in that trend, do you see sports monetization reaching the level of traditional sports? For example, if you think of it from a per fan basis.
Sure. From a per fan basis, I don't know. Maybe. The problem is, I think, there's a lot of unmonetized value in the esports space, and we have not found a good way to monetize it. You think about the fact that esports stars, they stream, they interact with their fans, they can reach out and touch them. Same thing with the organizations, the organizers. There's this, like we said, there's a conversation happening and there's interactivity happening, and that has value. That has a lot of value, but we don't know how to really monetize it. We do it via Twitter for free, right? We do it via Twitch and hope to get donations, and then maybe do a little bit of monetization against the Twitch stream. But that's a lot of value that we're missing. The thing is, I think sports faces a fundamental challenge. So it's kind of an upside and a downside. So the golden goose of traditional sports is the media rights, right? It's big money in media rights. It's sort of the holy grail. Everyone's very excited about the media rights all the time. And for the channels, it's a loss leader. It gets people interested in the channel. They want to watch the channels. There's a symbiotic relationship there. The thing is, and this is kind of the existential threat for the sports industry and what they're viewing, is the digitization of audiences. You know what I mean? Young people don't have cable subscriptions. I don't think I've ever paid for a cable subscription as an adult. I do all of my TV viewing digitally, right? Yeah. Digital viewing does not provide the same kind of media rights revenues. So they're holding on, but I genuinely expect as time goes on, the media rights payments that they're getting are going to slowly become less and less justifiable. And I'm not saying linear TV is ever going to die completely, but it's continuing to have a smaller and smaller market share, right? And that means that the value of ad sales on their channels when they're broadcasting sports events is going to go down, which means the overall revenue of the channels are going to go down, which means the media rights are going to have to come down eventually to some degree. So this is a existential crisis being faced by the sports industry. And I expect, honestly, sport revenues to go down per fan because of that. As esports, we are insulated from that because we're already digital. So we're already dealing with how shit digital is in some ways when it comes, sorry, I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but we're dealing with how terrible digital is when it comes to revenue generation from a media rights perspective. But at the same time, we don't have to worry about the digification of the audience because it's already digital. That's one challenge. Another challenge is we still don't know if it's going to make sense to do week in, week out stadiums full of people in the long term. I mean, one of the big benefits about the kind of localization and tribalization of traditional sports is you kind of have this built-in audience locally to come to your stadium. You know, if you are Amsterdam Ajax, you're the Amsterdam team, people in Amsterdam are going to be your fans, your stadium's in Amsterdam, maybe you can fill your stadium in Amsterdam. When you have these kind of global, almost exclusively global team identities, right? G2 Esports, FPF, like maybe they have a region, you know, FPF Phoenix is China is the region. G2 Esports is Europe for League of Legends. Other games, they're actually different regions. Team Liquid is part Dutch, part American, right? Like you don't have a localized fan base. So it's also going to be hard to fill 40,000 seats if your whatever millions of fans are dispersed pretty wildly throughout the world. They're not all localized in a city, or not as many of the hardcore ones are localized in a city like you might have with a Manchester United or an Ajax Amsterdam, or I don't know what your home football team is, but that team. So that presents a challenge to match day. Mm-hmm. If there are, I mean, the other challenge is one of the best advantages is digital, but the storefronts that fans use are owned by the publishers, right? They're not owned by the teams, they're not owned by the organizers. The storefront being the in-client storefront of the game they play and the game they watch. And when you're a publisher, if you basically you can think of the kind of client storefront and the things you develop for it, almost like a shop, right? A shop window. Now, if you have a choice between putting something that you made that doesn't use any esports IP in the shop window and you get to keep all of it, or putting something that you have to share half of it back with the tournament or team that you're working with, you don't want to put the development efforts into making the thing to begin with unless you have to, and then you're not going to want to promote it that much because it's just not, from a pure self-interested business perspective, it's not great business for you. So that's, sort of the most promising storefront is sort of dominated by the game publisher. So this is a long way of saying, yeah, there's a lot of challenges. You'll need some significant innovation in how organizations and how esports is monetized to have it reach sports levels. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying it's not happening in the next 5 years for sure, I think. And it's going to depend on how the technology changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, that kind of leads very well to my next question. So we, as investors, are pretty much entirely focusing on that kind of, as you mentioned, technologies which are trying to tackle that problem, monetization in the sports industry. So from an investor point of view, and from your point of view, because you have a lot of experience in the industry, what are some of the good investment opportunities that you see in esports going forward? And doesn't have to be necessarily linked to monetization, but that would also be an interesting kind of angle to think about it.
Yeah. So I think the most obvious one is if you see attractive tech plays that can unlock monetization, right? Ideally where they can sit as an intermediary and it's scalable. So if you have you can always have sort of sales agencies, marketing agencies, boutique agencies. Those are not going to transform the industry as much. But if you have someone who can really get and step into the middle of every sponsorship agreement or every interaction and take a piece of that, obviously that's, if they have an idea that works, that's got a lot of potential upside. I think that otherwise, a lot of the stuff you need to do in the space is probably going to be more consumer oriented than organizer and team oriented. The reason for that being that, well, kind of as we discussed with the struggles with monetization, it's not as though teams and organizers are flux to spend millions on cool products for themselves, right? If it brings them revenue, then that's going to be interesting. But if it's like, high-end AI-driven training platforms, like, you're going to need to have a consumer angle to that, or you're not going to be able to kind of get meaningful revenues out of it. So there are definitely interesting plays. I mean, we've seen a lot of investment interest in sort of those competition platforms, let's call them, things like skills, where you also have like a real money wagering attached to it. Like, all right, well, 1v1 me, bro, and we'll attach some money to it because it's not quite gambling, but it's almost gambling. And then gambling is a lot of money. Gambling. The esports, honestly, though, at this point, I would say, interestingly enough, gambling has moved much quicker in esports than almost anyone else, like, because they immediately saw, like, all right, well, this is something that we can do sports books on, and it's a new product, and it's got a younger audience. So the esports gambling industry is already pretty sophisticated, and even big traditional gambling houses run esports books, like stuff you would, and they've been doing it for years now. It's like, it's just, the gambling's was very fast and forward thinking on this. I think that, yeah, I mean, those are kind of some of the more interesting things. I think really, I believe, I think it's Fan AI is an interesting company, right? They do, I believe what they do is they act as a solution to get essentially advertising kind of looking organically in games while you're broadcasting. So especially for third-party organizers, if you are trying to get but I think they also work with publishers. If you're trying to get your sponsors, which is a great sales space, right? Because most of the match you're watching the screen. If you're trying to get your sponsors put into the in-game map, that's a great opportunity to drive revenues, and it's a little niche, but I think there's value there. So that was a cool company to look at. These are just some of the things that I've sort of looked around. It's also always going to depend, I think, with esports, because you could even make the argument that a team is a good investment if you look in the long term. But the big thing is making sure that and I guess it's true with any investment, but definitely within esports, is making sure that you're backing the right horse. Because there's a lot of people with pie in the sky ideas that have no real, like, applicability, or don't really get the space, or have dreams but no function. And if you don't understand the space, it's a very easy trap to fall into. So I guess, yeah, my number one thing is make sure you're backing the right horse, I think, in esports even more than other industries.
No, yeah, absolutely. We will definitely try to do that. So that's partially a reason why we've seen a lot of increase in funding in the industry, because it's a hot space and everyone's trying to be there. But it's still, I would say that investors are still figuring out what's the best place to position yourself after game and spotting the best, next game out there.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's super interesting. So going forward, maybe personally for you and for your future kind of endeavors, what are some of the things that you're planning to work on? What are some of the exciting projects you're looking forward to?
Sure. Well, yeah, we could talk about what Newzoo is getting up to. So I think the biggest and most exciting thing we've been on at Newzoo has been the platform, right? So we launched that, I believe, early last year, but this is kind of an ongoing product. The dream was essentially for anyone in games or esports to have all the data they need on pretty much everything in a single platform, in a single place, make sure it's actionable and meaningful and relevant. And so development for that platform is a ongoing and continuous effort. And it's really cool. I mean, we have very interesting stuff there. We have, console MAUs, we've got PC player share, but we've also got tons of viewership data, esports data. We have a product that actually has managed to isolate the specific viewership of different teams as they compete in an industry, which is an interesting thing, right? As opposed to in events, as opposed to just having like the aggregate hours an event, you can actually see how popular individual teams are, and you can see for their different games that they play, as well as the total organization. Meaningful information, for example, for commercial brands who are looking at consumer brands who are looking to sponsor in the space. So development for the platform is a perpetual and ongoing thing, and that is the company's project, I would say. We're always adding new features, and I think that, if anyone's ever interested in having a data platform to help facilitate their work in the games and esports space, then always get in touch with us.
Awesome. Sounds good. I can totally confirm that we are using Newzoo and your data, and it's been extremely helpful for us from an investor's point of view.
It's great to hear.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Remer. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I think we learned a lot of things about the next upcoming industry trends to look forward to.
Yeah, thanks, Viktoria. This has been super fun. Appreciate you inviting me on.
Thank you.
Cool.